SMT Nation, we are back. Nation, in today's video, I want to discuss AT&T's network building approach, their 5G network building approach. And I want to make something really, really clear. I'm not saying whether or not AT&T's 5G network is good or bad. I'm going to just drive home the point that AT&T's approach to building their 5G network is with one thing in mind. And that is it. Just one thing in mind. Let me tell you what it is, and let me give you guys my reasons. All right, so let's kind of recap what things have been happening at AT&T over the course of the last several years. For starters, I look at kind of AT&T's CapEx, their capital expenditures, what they spend in terms of dollars on their network building. They have a very heavy investment into fiber, enterprise, business, fiber to the premise, fiber to business. They are doing a pretty nice job there, right? I don't think that's really something we can argue. They're a legitimate national home broadband provider, if there is one, right? And one could argue that they might have the most fiber miles run to the premise, right? It might be. I'm not sure. Maybe it's another provider. I don't know. But maybe it's Verizon now, possibly with Frontier. I don't know, but they're definitely up there, right? AT&T is in that conversation. So they've been putting a large portion of their CapEx, which is usually around $21 or $22 billion per year for the last several years. They're spending a lot of money, and a bulk majority of that is probably fiber, which brings me back to their wireless network, which accounts for like 70% of their revenue, of their total revenue. And if a large or bulk majority of their CapEx spend is on fiber and wireline investment, well, then this kind of is a disconnect. And I think that's where this all starts. AT&T is focused on building the lowest cost 5G network. That's what they're trying to do. They clearly have had troubles with their stock. Investors have capitulated on multiple occasions. The stock sold down to very, very low levels. It's been recovering. They're definitely on an upswing, and there's upside for them as well. But it was definitely a point of contention for them. And they're very mindful of how the investor sees their debt levels and their spending. So they're very much in tune with that. But when I look at what they were able to accomplish with FirstNet, what have they really accomplished since then? Right? And that was a case where taxpayer dollars and government funding basically helped AT&T rebuild their entire network, densify their network, modernize their network. And what have they accomplished since then? Well, it's worth scrutinizing. They are third or last place in perceived 5G network perception. And that's because they have the least amount of 5G plus, right? Their mid-band 5G network build. They have the least amount of it in terms of millions of pops covered across the country. So if you're in a top market, right, a top 50 or a top 100 populated city, the AT&T network is likely adequate and pretty fast and is pretty modern. But once you go outside of there, things get pretty skimpy on the upgrades. And I think the thing that I started discussing about the investment, that's where that kind of happens, right? And then when I look at the spectrum position, AT&T, you kind of compare them to their competitors. Verizon has more mid-band spectrum. T-Mobile has more mid-band spectrum. They have more pops covered of mid-band spectrum, and they're not, the trend seems to be going in this direction, even in like the short term and the midterm. So when I'm thinking about the AT&T network and I look at the spectrum auction behaviors, AT&T got less C-band than Verizon. And overall, they have less mid-band than both Verizon and T-Mobile. They went with DoD, the 3.45 gigahertz, but it's only in a 40 megahertz chunk. And they might get more of it. And of course, that's going to need FCC approval, and they're going to have to grant them that exception. What if they don't? You know what I'm saying? Like and all chances of this happening, I guess, is contingent upon the new FCC with the new administration. They're probably betting on a dish failure and scooping up that spectrum. That will be regulated for sure, right? But overall, and when I look at giving up their network building and operations completely to Ericsson, everything continues to fall back to the one point. their focus is not on building the best 5G network. It's on building the lowest cost 5G network. I frequently used to kind of point in that direction of T-Mobile for doing that, right? Because they were focusing on low band and they had this really fragmented N41 build, but T-Mobile's been addressing that. T-Mobile has been scaling the upgrades. T-Mobile has been addressing the fragmented N41 holdings. They secured the white space licenses in Spectrum Auction 108. They've been buying N41 Spectrum licenses from other companies, doing Spectrum swaps. They're addressing the issue. I no longer feel the same way about T-Mobile that I used to, right? They definitely stabilized, secured, and kind of put everything together in their 5G ultra capacity network. AT&T, to me, seems to be focused on building a low-cost 5G network, but not necessarily the best 5G network they can build. I see it in their spending. I see it in their spectrum approach. Their unwillingness to scale the upgrades quickly, almost sort of seeming like, we'll get to it. We've got this pace and we're fine with it. No urgency. I'm not sure how it can be portrayed any other way when you look at the moves that and how they've been operating. For what it's worth, Verizon has built out their 5G ultra-wideband network at the fastest pace we've ever seen any company build out a mid-band frequency. And it's even faster than what they did with AWS. And they're still densifying, right? All I'm saying is this. AT&T does not appear to be trying to build the best 5G network. They appear to be trying to build their 5G network at the lowest cost. The Ericsson situation with the RAN equipment, moving away from Nokia, giving all the business to Ericsson, and only letting Ericsson do all that. And I'm looking at, the move to ORAN through Ericsson, but not using any other vendors. I look at the way they did the DoD and C-band auctions. They're trying to save money, and I respect and I understand business, but they're behind their competitors. I don't know if being cheaper on your network helps you close the perceived gap or performance gap with your competitors. There is a version of this video and conversation 5 years from now where we could be saying the same exact thing about AT&T. They're going to do what's best for their company. They're making all their own decisions. I'm not telling these people what to do. They're clearly brilliant and they're very smart and they have access to a lot of money and they're very powerful. But I think it just needs to be called out. Everything AT&T is doing is focused on cost and less about actually getting ahead and closing the gaps between them and their competitors in T-Mobile and Verizon. But what do you guys think? Tell me how you see the 5G build and the 5G network from AT&T. Is it good enough? Are they doing enough? Is there something you want them to kind of change in their approach? I gave you my take. That's kind of what I'm seeing. There's other things in networking that matter too. It's not just about spectrum, right? There's other things we could discuss. We could discuss the latency problems associated with the AT&T network. We could talk about the pops of coverage that I've stated earlier. We could discuss the modernization and new tower builds. There's so many things we could discuss, but generally speaking, AT&T's approach has been all about cost and not really about getting ahead, closing the gap with their competitors, which I think for now, this is probably going to be a future trend that isn't going to change, at least not based on how they're moving from what I can see. But what's your take? Do you guys have long-term, short-term, mid-term concerns about AT&T? How do you see them in terms of competition? Drop me a line. Let me know. You're the voice of the people, the SMT Nation. Let your voice be heard.